All right, let's talk about break-even point using contribution margin information. We're going to look at exercises 6, 7, and 6, 8. We're going to calculate break-even point in both the number of units you have to sell in order to break even and the amount of revenue you need to generate in order to break even. Ruby Corp reports the following information. So sales of 1.2 million, total variable costs of 800,000, total fixed costs of 600,000, units sold of 100,000 at this volume. Assuming there's no change to selling price per unit and variable cost per unit, what is the break-even point in units sold for Ruby Corp? So that's for 6.7, and then for 6.8, using the contribution margin approach, it wants us to calculate the amount of revenue you have to generate in order to break even. So there's a few things we have to look at. The first thing I want you to look at here is the formula for break-even point in units using the contribution margin approach. It's total fixed cost divided by the contribution margin per unit. So we weren't given contribution margin per unit in the question, but we can calculate that. Total fixed cost given was 600,000, so we already know that. We have to calculate contribution margin per unit. And how do we do that? It's the difference between total sales and variable costs. So remember, going back to the question sim, total sales was 1.2 million. Variable costs were 800,000. So the difference there of 400,000. And we're going to divide that by the units sold, which was 100,000 units. So if you look at the formula there, we're going to get a contribution margin per unit of $4. And again, what does that number represent? It's simply the amount of sales that is left over to cover fixed costs. And then once fixed costs are covered, then to contribute to the bottom line. So there's $4 left over for every sale. Based off of that, we can calculate the break-even point in units, which again, it's total fixed costs divided by contribution margin per unit. So in this case, the 600,000 divided by the $4 per unit. So in order for us to break even, assuming sales price and variable cost does not change, we have to sell 150,000 units. Now 6.8 asks us for the amount in revenue. You could do it a couple ways, but it did specify it wants to use the contribution margin approach. So that would be utilizing this formula here, the contribution margin, or sorry, this formula here, break-even point in revenue. It's total fixed costs. So the numerator is the same as what we calculated before. The denominator is what changes. Instead of dividing by contribution margin per unit, we're going to divide by contribution margin ratio. So we have to calculate contribution margin ratio. Total fixed cost is still 600,000. Contribution margin ratio, remember, that's our total contribution margin divided by total sales. So total contribution margin, which we indirectly calculated when we calculated contribution margin per unit, it's sales minus variable costs. So again, going back to the question stem, our total contribution margin would be sales of 1.2 million less variable cost of 800,000. So total contribution margin is $400,000. And we divide that by total sales. So you can see the formula there, sales minus variable cost divided by sales. We get a contribution margin ratio of a third, or 33.33%. Now we utilize that contribution margin ratio in our break-even formula to calculate the break-even point in revenue. And remember, it's total fixed costs divided by that contribution margin ratio. So in this case, the 600,000 divided by the 33.33 repeating percent, our break-even point in revenue is 1.8 million, meaning we have to sell $1.8 million worth of revenue to break even, or putting it in a different way, like we did in 6.7, we have to sell 150,000 units in order to break even. And what is break even? That's when there is no profit, but there's also no loss as well.